Chicago never sleeps, not really. Even in the dead of winter, when the wind comes off Lake Michigan and turns every street corner into a corridor of knives, the city breathes. In the headlights cutting through the fog, in the elevated trains grinding over rusted tracks, in the lights that never fully go out on the south side. Chicago pulses like a living thing, and like every living thing, it has its layers. What shows on the surface, the glass towers of Michigan Avenue, the museums, the loud stadiums, is just skin. Underneath, in the city's veins, runs something older, thicker, and infinitely more dangerous. Vincent Vitale knew every one of those veins better than any other man alive. He was seated at the head of a dark mahogany table on the 50th floor of a building in the Loop, the entire city spread below him like a map he had memorized in childhood. 41 years old. Dark hair with the first silver threads at the temples, square jaw, dark grey eyes that had the inconvenient habit of appearing to assess the value of everything and everyone that entered their field of vision. He was not a man who needed to raise his voice. He never had been. People who need to shout to be taken seriously are still trying to earn respect. Vincent Vitale had the kind of authority that entered a room before he did. Across the table, 6 men waited in silence, not the silence of comfort. The silence of men who understood that every word spoken in this man's presence would be weighed, evaluated, and remembered. Dom Caruso, the consigliere, sat to his right, 62 years old, hair completely white, the only man in the room who looked directly at Vincent without looking away. Marco Vitale, cousin and right hand, sat 3 chairs down, wearing that expression of carefully rehearsed loyalty that Vincent had accepted as real for 12 years. The meeting was about the South Port. It always was. The Drago family was pressing again, moving cargo through the terminal at night, corrupting inspectors who had been in the Vitale pocket for years, creating friction where there had once been absolute control. Stavan Drago, the patriarch of the Serbian family that had arrived in Chicago in the late 90s and built his own empire in the shadows of the Vitales, was a patient man. Dangerously patient. He didn't attack head-on, he corroded, like rust. Vincent listened to the reports without interrupting. When the last man finished speaking, he was silent for exactly 8 seconds, long enough for everyone in the room to feel the weight of that silence in their own shoulders. Then he said 3 sentences, gave precise instructions, ended the meeting. As the men filed out, Dom stayed behind. It was what he always did. It was what Vincent expected. The old consigliere waited for the door to close before speaking. He said there was something irregular in the port's financial reports, numbers that didn't align correctly. It wasn't an accounting error. It was a pattern. Someone was leaking information outside the circle. Dom didn't have a name yet, but he had a certainty, and in their world, Dom Caruso's certainty was worth more than anyone else's evidence. Vincent showed no visible reaction. He thanked him with a nod. But as he rode the private elevator down alone, the city unfolding below him through the glass, something shifted in the geometry of his thoughts. There was a traitor at the table, and Vincent had lived this story before. And that story had ended with Rachel. Rachel Vitale had died on a Tuesday in November 7 years earlier, when a car bomb meant for Vincent detonated at the wrong moment, in the wrong place, with the wrong person behind the wheel. She was 22 years old. She was taking the car to the shop because her brother had asked her to. A simple errand. A little sister's kindness. And that was exactly what killed her. Proximity to him. Vincent had not cried at the funeral. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he had decided, standing over that white casket, that he would never again give any enemy the satisfaction of knowing there was something capable of breaking Vincent Vitale. And the only way to guarantee that was simple, cruel, and absolute: have nothing left to lose. No visible attachments, no vulnerability, no woman, no friend who wasn't also an ally, no opening through which pain could enter, because pain always arrives with armed company. 7 years of penance. 7 years of functioning like an extraordinarily efficient and completely hollow machine. The assassination attempt happened on a rainy Thursday when Vincent's car was intercepted on a viaduct in the near West Side. They were professionals, careful planning, near-perfect execution. The near made all the difference. Vincent walked away with a cut above his left eyebrow and the certainty that the attack had been possible because someone had leaked his route. His route that day had been discussed in only one place, at the mahogany table on the 50th floor. The decision was made that same night. Vincent Vitale needed to disappear, not to another city, not to another country, but to the last place anyone would think to look for him. Inside Chicago itself, into the South Side where he had grown up before the money and the power, where faces didn't read Forbes and the name Vitale meant something very different from what it meant in the corridors of the Loop. Under the name Jack Mercer, he rented a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Halsted Street, paid 3 months up front in cash, left the secure phone with Dom, bought a prepaid cell at a drugstore, and disappeared from the surface of the city he controlled, while Dom Caruso, methodically and silently, began hunting the traitor. The apartment smelled of fabric softener and old wood. The bed creaked, the bathroom window didn't close all the way. Vincent lay down on the first night, stared at the peeling ceiling, and thought that it was the first time in nearly a decade that he was somewhere nobody knew where he was. No security outside the door, no protocol, just the sound of the elevated train passing 2 blocks away, the smell of clean laundry rising from below, and a silence unlike anything he had ever known. He slept 6 uninterrupted hours for the first time in months. The next morning, Jack Mercer needed coffee. And that was how it all began. Not with drama, not with destiny, not with any of the grand forces men tend to invoke when explaining the irreversible changes in their lives. It began with coffee. The Red Line Diner was 3 blocks from the apartment, squeezed between a closed newsstand and a shoe repair shop. It was the kind of establishment that exists in every city in the world, and that nobody from outside the neighborhood ever seeks out. Worn red stools, formica tables with scratches that had their own scratches, a laminated menu with mustard stains on the breakfast page, and a permanent smell of bacon and burnt coffee that had soaked into the walls over decades. Vincent walked in at 7:15 in the morning, wearing a dark jacket that wasn't cheap enough to be convincing as a regular man's clothing, but it was the best he'd managed the night before. The place was almost full. He assessed the room in 3 seconds, as he always did, and identified the only available seat, the last stool at the counter in the back section. He didn't see the sign, or he saw it and ignored it. The small sign propped against the napkin holder, written in red marker, Amber's section, enter at your own risk. He sat down. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then he heard footsteps. Not the careful steps of someone paying attention, but the quick, mildly irritated steps of someone who was already behind on something before the day had even started. He felt the warm impact on his left shoulder before he processed what had happened. Coffee. A considerable amount of coffee now running down the collar of the jacket that had cost $400. Vincent went completely still for a moment. It was the reaction of a man accustomed to processing threats before reacting to them, and his system had classified it as a threat before realizing it was just a cup. Amber Hayes was holding the coffee pot with an expression that combined professional irritation with something that, on another person, might have been embarrassment, but on her looked more like impatience. 28 years old, brown hair pulled back in a ponytail that had clearly started the day well tied and was progressively losing the battle, diner uniform with a small tear on the left sleeve that had been repaired with thread of a slightly wrong color. Brown eyes with that distinct quality of someone who has already heard every excuse and is no longer accepting new ones. She said she was sorry. She said it the way people say it when they're reasonably sorry but also feel that part of the blame is yours for having sat there. She extended a napkin, one napkin for a jacket covered in coffee, and asked what he wanted to order. Vincent looked at the napkin, looked at her, said he wanted to know first if there was more coffee where that had come from. Amber Hayes didn't laugh, didn't apologize again, just tilted her head slightly and said there was plenty of coffee, that she promised this time it would go inside the cup, and that if he wanted additional guarantees, he could pick the cup up himself when she brought it. Vincent ordered black coffee and scrambled eggs. She wrote it down without looking at him, turned and walked away. He sat looking at the soaked napkin in his hand for a moment, then folded it, placed it on the counter, and realized he felt the faintest trace of something he hadn't felt in more time than he could pinpoint. Not joy. It was more subtle than that. It was the precise texture of a moment that breaks a pattern. The coffee arrived inside the cup. The eggs were good. Amber Hayes spent the next 20 minutes serving 4 other tables with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for years and the patience of someone who clearly would have preferred to be doing something else but had bills to pay. When he asked for the check, she charged separately for the sugar he had put in his coffee. He looked at the line item on the bill, looked at her. She said it was on the menu, page 2, bottom right corner. He paid, left a tip, left. The next morning, he came back. The stool in Amber's section was available. This time, she didn't spill the coffee. She took the order with the same impatient efficiency and said, without him having asked anything, that if he planned on becoming a regular, he needed to know she didn't do small talk during the morning rush, that ketchup was charged separately, and that the diner's tipping policy was a suggestion, not an obligation. So if he was leaving expecting reciprocity, he was in the wrong place. Vincent said he understood the policy. She said great and went to get another table's order. He stayed 6 minutes longer than he had planned. On the third morning, she said his order before he opened his mouth. Black coffee, scrambled eggs, toast without butter, he confirmed. She wrote it down. Then, while filling the cup, asked without ceremony if he was living in the neighborhood or just passing through, because in 2 weeks she hadn't seen him here before, and suddenly he was there every day. Vincent said he had moved recently. Amber said Chicago in November was a terrible time to move, that winter was coming hard in another 2 weeks, and that if he didn't have a good coat, he was in trouble. He said he had a good coat. She said the jacket from the first day hadn't looked so good with coffee on it. Vincent looked at her for a moment, and then, for the first time in more time than he could precisely name, he smiled. Not the calculated smile he used in meetings, not the facade smile he put on when he needed to seem approachable. A real smile, small, almost involuntary, like something that escaped before it could be contained. Amber didn't appear impressed, but there was something in the way she turned her back that was slightly different from previous days. In the days that followed, Vincent discovered the outline of Amber Hayes's life in fragments. Not because she talked much about herself, quite the opposite, but because he paid attention in a way most people don't. She supported her younger brother through college. That became clear when she refused to swap a Thursday shift because she needed to make a deposit by noon. There were debts, medical ones, from the way she reacted when a co-worker mentioned health insurance with that mixture of sarcasm and resignation of someone who had been on the wrong side of that conversation before. There had been a man who had left when things got hard that surfaced in a single sentence, said in passing that she didn't repeat and clearly didn't intend to expand on. Amber Hayes had built a functional life on the ruins of abandoned expectations. She wasn't bitter. She was pragmatic. There was an enormous difference between the two, and Vincent, who had spent the last decade being confused with bitterness when he was really just disciplined, recognized the distinction immediately. She wanted nothing from him, didn't try to impress him, didn't adjust her behavior depending on how he reacted. She simply existed with that slightly exasperating honesty of people who have decided the social cost of diplomacy is too high for the return it offers. On a Thursday morning, with light snow beginning to fall outside and the diner unusually quiet, she leaned on the counter while he waited for his order and said, without preamble, that he seemed like the type of person who was used to things working the way he wanted. Vincent asked why she thought that. She said it was the way he looked at the menu, not like someone reading options, but like someone verifying whether the menu was correct. He was quiet for a moment, then said it was an interesting observation. She said she had been a waitress for 6 years. You learn to read people. He wanted to ask what else she had read in him, but didn't ask, because there were things in him that he definitely didn't want read. Dom Caruso called in the third week with an update. The pattern was becoming clearer. There was a consistent leak of operational information, always 6 to 8 hours ahead of Vitale movements, someone with access to the internal calendar. Dom didn't have a name yet, but he had 3 suspects. Marco Vitale was on the list. Vincent hung up the phone and stood at the apartment window with the snow falling outside. Marco had grown up with him. They had been raised as brothers after Marco's father died. They had buried Rachel together. 12 years of unquestioned loyalty, or loyalty that had seemed unquestioned because Vincent had decided that certain things didn't need to be questioned. It was exactly the kind of mistake Vincent knew how to recognize in others and had allowed himself to make. He returned to the diner the next morning quieter than usual. Amber noticed, of course she noticed, but didn't ask anything. Just placed the coffee in front of him and a few minutes later pushed forward a plate with a slice of apple pie he hadn't ordered. Said it was from the day before, that it was going to be thrown out anyway, and that the chef got offended when the pie was wasted. Vincent looked at the pie, looked at her. She had already turned to the next table. He ate the pie. It was good. It was 5 weeks into the Red Line diner when Vincent recognized, in a moment of honesty with himself, that he hadn't asked for, and would have preferred not to have, that the reason he came back every morning was not the coffee, which was mediocre, nor the eggs, which were good but not extraordinary, but the certainty that Amber Hayes would be there with that authentic impatience and that permission-free honesty and that habit of pushing apple pie forward without making a ceremony of it. It was the most dangerous thing that had happened to him in 15 years. He stayed 2 days away from the diner, stayed in the apartment, worked through the secure phones, refused the feeling that kept trying to settle in his chest every time he thought about the counter stool. She was a waitress. He was Vincent Vitale. There was a traitor inside his organization, a rival family trying to take the South Port, and decades of power structure that depended on his ability to keep his head clear. There was no room, there was no possibility, and more than anything, he had made a promise over Rachel's grave that was not going to be broken by feelings he had not requested. On the morning of the third day, he went back to the diner. Amber saw him come in, went to the stool, placed the cup before he sat down and said, without any particular tone, that the chef had made lemon pie today and it was better than the apple. Vincent said he would try it. She wrote it down, turned, left, and that absolutely unremarkable non-event did something that no threat, no betrayal, and no assassination attempt had managed to do in 15 years. It made Vincent Vitale feel that there was something in this place in the world that was, against all logic and all prudence, good. Dom called on the following Friday. The investigation had converged. There was a meeting scheduled for the next week between a Vitale financial intermediary and a man connected to the Drago family. The meeting had been arranged from the inside. The intermediary had been identified. The name of the internal contact would be confirmed within 48 hours. Vincent listened, processed, thanked him, and told Dom to call when he had the name. On Saturday morning, Vincent arrived at the diner at 8 and found Amber arguing with a customer who had tried to complain that the coffee was cold when the cup had arrived hot and had gone cold because he had spent 40 minutes on the phone. Amber was explaining with carefully controlled patience that the diner could not be held responsible for the natural cooling of hot liquids over time, and that if the gentleman wanted hot coffee, she would gladly bring another but would need to charge for it because the first had been properly served. The customer left without a tip and with an expression of outrage. Amber pivoted on her heels, passed by the counter, picked up her notepad, and told Vincent he had arrived early. He said he had slept well. She said he looked it, and there was something different in her tone. Less automatic, more present, as if the observation wasn't professional, but genuine. They were quiet for a moment. Then she asked, without looking at him, if he was enjoying the South Side, if he had settled in. He said he had, said it was different from what he had expected. She asked what he had expected. He was quiet for a second and said he had expected it to feel temporary, that he would feel like he was passing through. But it was starting to feel different. Amber looked at him, really looked this time, not the quick assessment of a waitress reading a customer, but something slower. Then said that the South Side did that to people, that the neighborhood was rough on the surface, but had the distinct quality of places that don't try to impress anyone, which in her experience made everything more real. Vincent said he understood exactly what she meant. She nodded as if something had been confirmed and went to get the order. Dom's contact came through Sunday night. The name was Marco Vitale. Vincent sat in the dark apartment for an hour after hanging up the phone, with Chicago glowing through the window and the smell of fabric softener rising from the laundry below. 12 years, Marco had sold Rachel. Not directly, not intentionally, but it had been Marco who had provided the route that November morning 7 years ago, and he had only begun feeding information to the Dragos afterward, when the weight of what he had done became too heavy, and Stavan Drago found the right angle of pressure. Vincent didn't feel anger. He felt something colder and more permanent than anger. He felt the geometry of everything clicking into its correct places, as always happened when the truth finally became clear enough to be seen whole. He called Dom, gave precise instructions. Marco would be isolated, neutralized, and confronted in a controlled manner. Nothing rushed, nothing that would compromise the larger investigation. There was still the question of the Dragos, who now knew Vincent was in motion. Dom said there were indications that Stavan Drago had sent people searching the south side in the last 48 hours. Vincent told Dom to double surveillance and hung up. On Monday morning, there was a van he hadn't seen before, parked half a block from the diner. On Tuesday, there was a man at the coffee cart across the street who stayed there for 3 hours without buying a newspaper. On Wednesday morning, Vincent didn't go to the diner. He stayed in the apartment monitoring through the phones, requesting updates from Dom every 2 hours. Dom confirmed 2 Drago men on the south side, apparently on a reconnaissance operation. They hadn't identified the apartment yet, but they were getting closer. Vincent made the decision any rational version of himself would make. He needed to move, change location, increase distance between himself and anyone in the neighborhood who could be used as leverage. Anyone, including a waitress at the Red Line diner. He spent the day doing what was necessary, packed the apartment, called Dom with alternate coordinates, prepared the secure phones for transition. Did everything right, methodically, as he always did. And at 6 in the evening, already with the bag packed, he found that there was a limit to how loudly discipline could speak over something else. He went to the diner on the dinner shift. Amber was there, on a double shift, the kind she picked up when she needed extra money for her brother, which was more often than it should have been. The diner was busier than in the morning, loud, smelling of burgers on the grill, and the elevated train passing every 12 minutes outside. She saw him come in with that slightly different expression. Not surprise, but something a person less trained than Vincent to read signals might have missed. She hadn't expected him to come for dinner, but she didn't say that. Just indicated a table near the window and said she'd be over in a minute. Vincent sat, looked at the street, looked at the van that hadn't moved since morning. When Amber came with the menu, he said, low, without ceremony, that she should be careful in the coming days, that she should avoid being alone, leaving work late at night. She looked at him with that direct expression. Asked why. He said the neighborhood had gotten less safe recently, that it was temporary, but real. Amber looked at him for a moment with that quality of attention he had noticed in her from the beginning. That way of really looking at things instead of just glancing over them. Then said he didn't seem like the type of man who worried about neighborhood safety in a general way. That when he said something, there was always something concrete underneath. Vincent said it was just precaution. She said fine, she would be careful, and went to take another table's order. He stayed 30 minutes longer than he had planned. When he left a tip large enough to cover her entire shift. On Thursday morning, at 6:42, Dom Caruso called in the tone of voice Vincent had learned to associate with situations that had no clean solution. Amber Hayes had left the diner at 11:40 the night before. She had not arrived home. The security camera at the back parking lot showed 2 men approaching her beside her car. The image quality was poor, but sufficient to identify the style, Drago operation. Dom had confirmed through an internal contact that Stavan Drago had personally authorized the move. There was a message. A photo of Amber sitting in a chair with an expression that Vincent recognized immediately. Not as fear, but as that controlled anger of people who don't have the habit of showing weakness even when they're afraid, and an ultimatum. Vincent Vitale would present himself alone at the provided address within 24 hours, or Amber Hayes would leave the West Side in a permanent way. Dom was on the line, waiting for instructions. Vincent was quiet for exactly 4 seconds, then told Dom to activate all available Vitale men in Chicago, told Dom to locate the address and map the perimeter, said he wanted the building's layout, number of men, entry and exit routes, everything within 3 hours. Dom said his name, just the name, in the tone of someone who needed to ask a question they knew wouldn't be well received. Vincent said he knew what he was doing. Dom said he was making himself a target, that it was exactly what the Dragos wanted, that there were other ways to resolve this. Vincent said there was one way, and it was the one he had stated, told Dom to start immediately, and hung up. He stood in the center of the apartment that smelled of fabric softener. The bag was still leaning against the wall, ready for a departure that hadn't happened. Through the window, Chicago was beginning to lighten with the November dawn, that grey, cold light that turned buildings into silhouette and the lake into lead. Rachel's face passed through his mind, as it always did in that particular sequence. First Rachel, then the guilt, then the rule he had built over the guilt. No attachments, no vulnerability, no reason to be found. And then Amber's face. The expression in the photo, not terror, not collapse, but that slightly furrowed brow of someone processing an unjust situation and cataloguing exactly what they're going to say to whoever is responsible when they get the chance. In that warehouse, alone, Amber Hayes was already making a plan. He knew it the same way he knew things about people that they hadn't told him, from watching, from years of reading human behavior under pressure. She wasn't falling apart. She was waiting, taking inventory of the room, counting the guards' rotations, noting which one was careless with the door. She was furious and calculating and completely, stubbornly herself, even in the worst moment of her life. Amber Hayes was in a West Side warehouse because she had served coffee to the wrong man, because she had pushed apple pie forward without making a ceremony of it, because she had existed with enough honesty to break through 15 years of armor without even trying. Vincent Vitale had spent 7 years avoiding being the reason another person died, and there, on that November morning, with the city waking up outside, he discovered there was something even more unbearable than that, the possibility of having been the reason and doing absolutely nothing about it. He grabbed the coat, the good coat, not the jacket from the first days, left the apartment without looking at the bag. The warehouse was on the west side, on an industrial street between Ogden Avenue and the river, surrounded by structures that had been factories in the 50s and were now the architecture of urban abandonment. Covered windows, marked walls, the hollow silence of places that progress had left behind. Exactly the kind of place the Dragos chose, isolated enough not to draw attention, large enough to operate. Dom had delivered what he had promised in 3 hours: building layout, confirmation of 11 men inside, 2 entrances, 1 emergency exit in the back that had been blocked but not sealed. Stavan Drago was not personally present, consistent with his style. He was never where things happened. He was always 2 degrees removed, far enough to deny, close enough to control. The Vitales positioned at 2 in the afternoon. 16 men, Vincent at the front, not at the protected distance he normally maintained, but in the forward line, which had left Dom with the expression of a man containing 10 things he wanted to say and had decided to say only one, that it was unnecessary. Vincent had said he knew. The operation lasted 11 minutes. It was clean in the way operations conducted by people who know exactly what they're doing are clean, not without force, but without waste. The Drago men didn't expect the speed, didn't expect the full force, and definitely didn't expect Vincent Vitale to be personally at the main entrance at 2:16 in the afternoon, with his eyes that particular shade of dark grey that people who knew him had learned to recognize as the state in which he was most dangerous. completely calm. Amber was in a room at the back, tied to an industrial chair, with a small cut on her chin where she had resisted enough for someone to need to restrain her. There were 3 men in the room. All 3 made bad decisions in very quick succession. Vincent entered after the room was cleared. Amber was looking at the door when he walked in, and there was something in her expression that he processed in layers, the same way he had learned to process complex situations over 20 years in the underworld. On the surface, relief. Beneath the relief, confusion. Beneath the confusion, that focused attention of hers, that way of really looking at things, cataloguing, evaluating, building a picture that was not yet complete. But there was something else too, something he hadn't expected, and that hit harder than anything that had happened in those 11 minutes. She looked at him, not with the eyes of a hostage seeing a rescuer. She looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had spent hours alone in that room thinking and had arrived somewhere. There was a clarity in her expression that was almost more unsettling than fear would have been. He cut the bindings, asked if she was all right. She said yes, in the dry tone of someone who isn't going to pretend the adrenaline isn't maxed out, but also isn't going to collapse on anyone. Then she looked at him, at the men waiting outside the room, at the way they moved in relation to him, at the authority he occupied in that space without needing to announce it, at the Vincent who had emerged in those 11 minutes and who was completely, unequivocally different from the Jack Mercer who drank black coffee every morning at the counter stool. She said, with a steady voice and completely open eyes, that she had known he was hiding something, that she hadn't known it was everything. Then, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something, she said one more thing. Quietly, almost to herself, but loud enough for him to hear. That while she was sitting in that chair, she had spent a long time deciding whether she was angrier at him for lying or at herself for not having looked away when she still could. She had her answer. She wasn't angry at herself. Vincent said nothing immediately. He had said enough in lies over the last 2 months. He wasn't going to add one more in the only direction in which he wanted, for the first time in a long time, to be completely honest. He said only that he would explain everything, and that she could do whatever she wanted with the explanation. She said she could bet she would. They walked out of the warehouse into the late November afternoon, settling over the west side. Dom waited outside with that expression of a consigliere who had watched his boss do something emotionally understandable and tactically questionable, and had decided not to comment. This time. In the days that followed, things moved at the pace of situations that had been under pressure for a long time and had finally reached their resolution point. Marco was confronted, not with violence, but with the cold precision of Vincent when he had made a decision about someone. Marco didn't deny it. There were 7 years of guilt over Rachel's death pressing down with enough weight that the truth came out without much effort. The matter was resolved the way such matters are resolved in the Vitale world, definitively, without process and without appeal. Stavendrago received a message through channels that left no trace. The message didn't need to be long. There was a new clarity in the balance of power between the two families now that the board had been fully revealed. And Drago, a calculating man above all else, was pragmatic enough to recognize when a move had failed and when continuing to press would cost more than it was worth. Vincent found Amber on a Sunday afternoon in the only place that made sense to find her, the Red Line Diner after her shift, when the place was nearly empty and the light came through the windows with that distinct quality of November afternoons in Chicago, horizontal and golden and almost melancholy. He told her everything, not in abstractions, not in half words, not with the professional euphemisms he had developed over decades to make what he was softly palatable. He told her how the Vitale family had been built, what it controlled, how it operated. He told her about Rachel. He told her about 15 years of absolute rule and the reason for it. He told her about Jack Mercer and what he had intended and what had happened that hadn't been intended. Amber listened to everything without interrupting. It was a quality of hers he had noticed from the beginning. When she decided to listen, she really listened, without already formulating her response while the other person was still talking. When he finished, she was quiet for some time, then said there was a difference between a lie and an omission, but that from the receiving end the difference was sometimes academic. Said she understood the reason. Not that she approved, but that she understood. Said the world he lived in was real, and its rules, as strange as they were to her, had an internal logic she could follow. Then she said there was one thing she needed to understand. That he had gone to get her personally. Hadn't sent anyone. Had gone himself. And she needed to know why, because it was going to determine what she did with everything he had just told her. Vincent said he had already lost one person for being who he was, that he had spent 7 years making it impossible to lose anyone else the same way, because he had eliminated the possibility of there being anyone to lose. That it had worked until it stopped working. Amber kept looking at him, then said he was the most complicated man she had ever met, and that was a considerable achievement given her history. He said he knew. She said she was going to need time to think. He said he understood. She said that in the meantime he could have coffee, that her shift had ended but the pot was still warm. They served themselves without ceremony, with the city of Chicago darkening outside and the train passing every 12 minutes, and sat at the Red Line diner counter while November turned the windows into mirrors and the silence between them carried the particular weight not of emptiness but of a space that had been opened and was still being filled. Vincent Vitale had built an empire on the premise that vulnerability was death. He had sustained that for 15 years as an absolute truth, proven by experience, confirmed by every assassination attempt and every betrayal and every grave he had visited. There was an impeccable logic in that premise. It remained a logically sound premise. It was just that there, in that diner smelling of bacon and coffee with the sound of the train outside, Vincent discovered that some things could continue being true and at the same time stop being enough. That a rule built on a loss could protect against losing again, but could do nothing about what was already being lost slowly, day by day, inside a man who had decided to have nothing left to lose. Amber Hayes hadn't needed his money to see him, hadn't needed his name, his power, any of the things that defined Vincent Vitale to every other person in the world. She had seen Jack Mercer, the smaller, ordinary, unarmored version, and had decided that warranted a cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie that was going to be thrown out anyway. It was the simplest thing that had ever happened to him in his entire adult life. It was also the most extraordinary. Chicago was still out there, alive and indifferent and absolutely itself, with all its ports and shadows and families and secrets. Vincent Vitale's world continued existing, with all its demands and consequences, and the heavy permanence of someone who had built something that couldn't simply be walked away from. That was true too. But there was a difference that those weeks on the South Side, in the apartment smelling of fabric softener at the counter of the Red Line diner, had created inside him that couldn't be undone. Vincent Vitale now knew what it felt like to exist for someone who wanted nothing except his presence. And having discovered that, the absence of it was an entirely different thing from before. when he hadn't even known something was missing. Amber finished her coffee without speaking for a long time, then said, without looking at him, that there was something that needed to be said, that she had also built walls, that her reasons were different from his, but the result was similar. A functional and fairly lonely life she had decided to call independence because it was easier than calling it by its real name. Said she wasn't going to pretend she knew what to do with all of this, that his world was real and had weight and real consequences, and she wasn't the type of person who pretended complicated things were simple. But she also said there was a difference between complicated and impossible, and that in her experience most things people called impossible were really just complicated in a way that was frightening. Vincent said that was an important distinction. She said she knew, then looked at him finally with that complete attention that had disarmed him from the beginning, and said she would take the time she had asked for, but that in the meantime he could keep coming to the diner as long as he didn't expect special treatment and understood that ketchup was still charged separately regardless of who he was. He said he perfectly understood the policy. She said good. Washed the cups, turned off the counter lights. They walked out together into the November cold of Chicago, with the wind coming off the lake and the south side lights reflecting off the thin snow on the sidewalks. There was no declaration, no clean resolution, none of the endings that stories tend to promise when they reach this point. There were two adults with heavy histories leaving a diner at 8 in the evening, walking in the same direction for now, discovering that sometimes that is enough to begin. Vincent Vitale had survived betrayals, bullets, decades in the underworld, and 15 years of surgically constructed solitude. Amber Hayes was the only thing he hadn't tried to survive. And for the first time, standing in the cold with the city that had shaped him, stretching out in every direction, with the woman beside him who had seen through every version of him he had tried to present and chosen to stay anyway. He didn't want to.